I'm in Thomaston, Connecticut, a town literally named after the company famous for making these, the Seth Thomas Metronome. If you purchased a metronome in America anywhere between 1880 and 1980, chances are good that it was a Seth Thomas. Except Seth Thomas didn't actually make this metronome. Instead, they purchased units from Paquet, one of the last great German metronome houses. Right here in the factory behind me, they would rebrand and sell them under the Seth Thomas logo. Except Paquet isn't responsible for this metronome either. They took over manufacturing from Micheal and adapted their designs. Johann Micheal is widely credited as the inventor of the modern metronome, patenting his idea in 1815. Except it wasn't his idea either. He stole the idea from this dude, Dietrich Nicholas Winkels, who had the idea for what he called a musical chronometer just a couple years beforehand. So why am I telling you about the incredibly shady lineage of these musical pendulums? Am I just weirdly obsessed with early 1800s German patent law fraud? Am I masking my insecurities about recording to a click so I make a whole documentary-length YouTube video to bash on some metronomes? Or is there something deeper to be found in the history of how musicians and music consumers mark time? Rubato is a tempo term you'll encounter occasionally in scores. It means to play freely. This allows the performer to ebb and flow through a piece, taking rhythmic liberties with pulse in order to be more expressive. The term is Italian, as so many music terms often are. It dates back to the early 1720s when composer Pier Francesco Tosi coined the phrase rubar il tempo in his seminal vocal treatise, Observations on the Florid Song. He'd predominantly write about two different kinds of rubato, contrametric and agogic. Contrametric rubato is when the melody of a given piece is afforded some rhythmic flexibility while the underlying accompaniment remains more or less static. Think The Voice. Watch any episode and you'll start to understand contrametric rubato. The music a contestant will sing over will have a stable pulse, because more than likely it's just a track.
Caught up in your love affair and we'll never be royals. It's all running our blood.
But the contestants always have this weird way of rushing or dragging on part of the sung melody.
Take me to church, I'll worship like a dog. At the shrine of your lives, I'll tell you my sins so you can sharpen your knife.
Presumably because they wanted to add some sort of like crazy, showy kind of run.
My baby don't mess around because she loves me so. And this I know for sure.
Or just needed to take a breath, or maybe just for stylistic purposes. I don't know why it seems to be a thing on these singing shows specifically, but that's basically contrametric rubato in a nutshell. Agogic rubato is where both the melody and the rhythm of a piece are affected together and are free to move in and out of a regular beat in synchrony. This kind of rubato is likely going to be more familiar to you. Think Romantic era. Basically anyone performing Chopin will rely heavily on the freedom imparted by agogic rubato. Eventually, through the centuries, we'd see a compression of both of these terms into what we now notate as simply rubato. Of course, Pier Francesco Tosi did not invent the idea of rhythmic elasticity. He was just the first to call it rubato. A proto-version of this idea was found in the 9th century Codex of St. Gall, where letters would be used in combination with neumes, a kind of early version of modern music notation to indicate where rhythm should be slowed down or sped up. And it's not hard to imagine that even before we had a word for it, humans have been taking liberties with rhythm and pulse since perhaps the beginning of rhythm and pulse. Tempo rubato is typically translated to free in presentation, but literally to stolen time. I'd like to linger on this idea of stolen time for a while and let that thought set the tenor for the rest of this video. Almost all popular music today is grid-based. We record on digital audio workstations that are programmed with a bias towards mechanized, mathematically governed time. Not much rubato to speak of. Defining a steady pulse is no longer the job of the musician, it's a job for the click track. We use pitch correction or auto-tune on basically every serious production to give it a specific professional shine. Humanistic rhythms from drummers to bassists get quantized, smashed to node points, intersections on the grid to ensure a perfect metronomic performance. And that's when you can actually get a real drummer on your track. But hang on a minute. Before I go full boomer and morph into some sort of bargain brand Rick Beato, I'd like to take the time to understand how it is that we got here, and if it's even such a bad thing in the first place. So come with me to the moment in history where our relationship with time, musical and otherwise, changed forever. Could it all have started with this little clock? Before 1815, tempo markings on scores looked a lot more like these Italian words, and less like they do today with these neat and precise numbers. But why? Well, it's kind of Beethoven's fault. In 1815, Ludwig van Beethoven was introduced to a rudimentary version of the metronome. He would eventually come to understand it as an absolute game changer and would advocate for its usage religiously. At the time, his health had been on the decline, and his worsening deafness stifled his creativity. We gather from the many letters he'd write to family and colleagues that he'd find it difficult to work and was running out of money. In the BBC documentary Being Beethoven, conductor Mark Hasselbach suggests through an armchair psychoanalysis that maybe the metronome provided him with a sense of control.
We might see this also as the attempt of an aging composer to keep control of things. Control of his music with the device of the metronome, control of his financial situation, because Beethoven couldn't get any fees anymore as a performer.
Only 2 years later, Beethoven would publish metronome markings for his first 8 symphonies. He wholeheartedly adopted the rhythmic mechanization of his music, or at least the practice performance instructions of it. More on that in a little bit. While initially met with skepticism, the rest of the European world would soon follow suit. With Beethoven's backing, the metronome would catch on like wildfire, redefining rhythmic governance forever. Beethoven himself would write, "I have thought for a long time of giving up these nonsensical terms. Allegro, andante, adagio, presto, and Melzel's metronome gives us the best opportunity to do so." Melzel's metronome. That's Johann Nepomuk Melzel. The same Melzel, in fact, who claimed to have invented the metronome, but in reality stole the design from a much poorer, much more obscure inventor. Let's set the story. Amsterdam, Holland, the world's technical trade show at the University of Sciences, Literature, and Fine Arts. 1815. This is where inventors, engineers, and businessmen would gather to show off new technical innovations and products to be picked up from market and distribution. 37-year-old inventor Dietrich Winkel has scrounged up enough money to present something he's been working on for the latter part of a decade: the musical chronometer. A spring-powered, inverted pendulum rod with adjustable weights which provided a range of steady tempo pulses as a reference for musical time. No one would know it then, but Winkel's unassuming little timekeeper, a messy hodgepodge of amateur clockwork machinery, would soon become an unstoppable force, sweeping across the Western world for the next 100 years. At this point, there's been numerous attempts at what you might call a proto-metronome. the chronometer Pridgeon York from the clockmaker William Pridgeon in the late 1700s, the chronomètre from Etienne Lullier in the 1600s. Even Galileo's early work with pendulums can be thought of as a kind of early musical timekeeper. But none of them really came close to Winkel's design. True, consistent tempo control with an audible reference click. He had truly invented the world's first modern metronome, except it wasn't called that just yet. Enter Johann Micheal. Micheal is kind of a nepo baby. His dad is this famous organ builder, well-traveled, well-connected. Because of his father's status, he'd be highly educated as both a musician and an engineer, all in a time where not a whole lot of people were traveled or highly educated. Micheal came from money, but when it came time for him to leave his mark, he took shortcuts. Most of his inventions were just straight-up scams or designs he'd secretly purchased off of other inventors. Although he did have one obsession: automatons, mechanical devices made to imitate humans, like his automated trumpeter, the sound of which could be controlled with leather bellows which acted like synthetic lungs. Kinda weird, kinda strange, but trust me, automata was all the rage for the upper class at this time. A couple of my favorite Micheal stories for you, real quick, just so you can get a flavor of exactly who we're dealing with here. Once in Vienna, he buys this under-the-table chess-playing robot called the Turk, rebrands it as his own, and markets it as the ultimate battle of wits between man and machine, claiming that his automata could beat any human alive. However, he neglects to mention that there was never any actual computing mechanism inside the Turk. The whole thing is a big con. Micheal would hire different chess masters to hide inside the device every night on his automaton tour. There they could pretend to make the moves as the machine itself. Basically, every single story about this guy is shady. He builds these specialized hearing devices that are supposed to help the deaf, but they don't really end up working all too well. He undercuts and underpays basically every single musician that he hires, and for some reason starts this campaign to lie about it in the papers. There's one point where he gets into this copyright dispute. He claims to have paid a composer 500 ducats for the rights to their music, but that composer fired back with proof that he'd only been paid 50, and that the deal was a forgery that he didn't even consent to. Eventually, he somehow befriends Beethoven and convinces him to write a piece for one of his new devices, the Panharmonicon, a sort of symphony in a cabinet. He wants to premiere this piece and his device for a concert he's putting on benefiting soldiers of war. Beethoven delivers his famous Battle Symphony to Micheal, but his machine can't handle the piece. It's too complicated. A true engineer at this point would probably go back to the drawing board. How can I fix my device or make it more efficient so it can, I don't know, be able to handle music specifically written for it by perhaps the greatest composer of our day? But Micheal, no, he's no true engineer. So what does he do? He goes behind Beethoven's back, edits the crap out of his score, premieres the piece all without even telling him, and get this, smack dab, front page on the concert programming, he writes that the music, Beethoven's Battle Symphony, is his own property. Beethoven sues the living daylights out of him, and in his deposition drops what can only be considered the coldest 19th century diss track. Quote, Micheal is a rude, churlish man entirely devoid of education or cultivation. It is easy to conceive the tenor of his conduct to me during this time, which still further irritated me. Oh, and it gets worse, because that concert, the one Micheal himself put on, the one benefiting soldiers of war, yeah, Micheal only had one thing to say after that concert was over. Quote, if it is only said in London that people have paid 10 gulden for admission here, that is all I care about. The wounded are nothing to me. The wounded are nothing to me. So what happens when you put a guy like that in a room with a guy who's brilliant but naive, like Dietrich Winkel? Well, he rips him off, of course. Winkle was a brilliant inventor, but what he possessed in ingenuity, he lacked in business acumen. He knew he had something special with his musical chronometer, but just had no idea how to market the thing. So when Winkle bumps into Micheal, a known tech guru at the Amsterdam conference, he asks for his advice on how he should promote it. This would turn out to be Winkle's big mistake. Micheal graciously agrees to take a look, asks some questions, finds out that Winkle hasn't patented it yet, so he takes apart his device right in front of him. Even has to have Winkle help him put it back together. He says he can't help him, but he would think about it and get back to him soon. A few months later, Micheal would emerge from his Vienna workshop with a device identical to Winkle's in one hand and a patent for the world's first metronome in the other. Winkle got screwed over. To his credit, Micheal seemed to know a good idea when he saw one. He saw dollar signs in the musical chronometer and had the foresight to understand how consequential this invention could be. So what does he do? Well, he does what he always does. He steals it. Micheal adds a scale to the pendulum design, slaps his name on it, files a patent, and makes a fortune. He does a rebrand. Musical chronometer? No, that's not sexy enough. Not for a machine that will change the face of music itself. We need something elegant, something precise, something that will let the world know that this device is here to change things. What about the Greeks, he thinks? They like math and measuring stuff, I guess. And with that, the metronome was born. A fusion of the Greek metron, to measure, and nomos for law. Now, the race to mechanize musical time is on. Micheal makes a crazy play. He goes back to Beethoven, the man who literally sued him just 2 years earlier. The man who, you'll recall, called him rude, churlish, and entirely devoid of education, and somehow convinces him that the metronome is the future, and that he needed to get on board. To Micheal, the metronome was the perfect tool to usher in the new mechanized world he had been obsessed with his entire career. Times were changing after all. Farm cultivation was being augmented by large industrious machines, the cotton gin had just been invented, and the textile industry was booming with mechanization. The world started running on mechanical clocks in a very potent and real way, and it was more successful and profitable than ever. In the same year Micheal patents the metronome, George Stephenson, the civil engineer known as the father of railways, puts his first steam-powered locomotive into service, basically greenlighting an entire industry of steam-powered everything. Later that year, Friedrich Gauss would begin work on the mathematical proofs that basically led to the invention of number theory. And even right here in Connecticut, Eli Terry would revolutionize the clock industry with the world's first industrial machine, mass-produced from interchangeable parts. Everything in every industry seemed to be getting more and more efficient as we began to assert a new kind of mechanical dominance on the world around us. Mechanization is the future, Micheal reasoned. Things are changing, so why shouldn't how we think about music change, too? Beethoven fell, hook, line, and sinker. The pair would embark on educational tours together, convincing schoolmaster after schoolmaster to adopt the metronome as the gold standard for teaching musical time in classrooms. The invasion of the metronome at this point in time just could not be stopped. Micheal was so good at promoting that he got himself appointed as Vienna's royal court inventor, all without really doing much inventing. Of course, not everyone was hip to the ways of the gnome at first tick. Johann Brahms would outright reject the metronome, saying that he thought it provided no value. When asked if he would be adding numerical tempo markings to his past works, he would say, "Good friends have talked me into putting them there, for I, myself, have never believed that my blood and a mechanical instrument go well together." In his essays on conducting, Richard Wagner would write that after hearing a performance of one of his early operas that were notated with his own metronome markings, that he'd realized that applying math to music is an uncertain business, and that he would not be using a metronome again. There were other issues too. The metronome for many was prohibitively expensive. Beats per minute, or BPM, was a fairly new concept at the time, so to those who could not afford a metronome, reading BPM markings on sheet music was fairly useless. This criticism was levied by Gottfried Weber, a prominent music theorist at the time, who, in addition to cost complaints, dismissed the rhythmic rigidity of the metronome altogether, favoring instead a simple thread pendulum. With just a little bit of wood, a length of thread, and a small weight, anyone, anywhere, Weber argued, could build a sufficient tempo tool for practice. But if you're anything like me, you're probably scratching your head right now, wondering, how is this thing meant to actually work? First off, the pendulum doesn't make a click sound like a metronome does, so you're left to follow it with visual cues alone. It's kind of like a 19th century Guitar Hero, but the sound is off, and you have to read your music and look at the reference swing at the same time. In other words, this metronome, the supposed keeper of time, turns out to be a really unreliable timekeeper. But the really weird part about this is that Gottfried Weber knew this. He wrote about it and he understood it, yet he decided to advocate for its use anyway. None of that bothered him because his conception of time was literally different than yours or mine. He wasn't ruled by mechanical precision. To him, musical time was a living, unspoken rhythm. And it wasn't just him either. Everyone's relationship to the idea and concept of musical time was different pre-industrial revolution compared to post. Let me say that one more time. Musicians had a fundamentally different understanding of time back then than we do now. Let's unpack that. Welcome to the pre-metronomic era, Thomaston, Connecticut, circa 1815. Before the metronome and the Seth Thomas Company, where we stand now was known as Plymouth Hollow. One sense of musical time here in this place in history is governed by fundamentally humanistic rhythms, a living, temporal relationship between sound and the organic means by which we divide it. Make no mistake, precise equal divisions of beats are still very much the rule here, but the way that we, the people of the pre-metronomic age, go about measuring them is deeply intuitive, culturally informed, and governed by the agency of our own bodies. I, for example, as a music teacher, without a mechanical reference for tempo or pulse, might spend extra time with my students ensuring they know what a steady pulse is supposed to feel like. We do things like tap our feet to the beat or clap or even count along as they practiced and clunked along on their instruments. At this time, there would be no objective reference for tempo of a given piece. We'd have to work that out from memory, experience, and education on tempo terms. Musicologist Alexander Bonus writes in his History of the Metronome and Rhythm that prior to the 20th century, musical temporality was ultimately defined through subjective perceptions and actions, referenced through living variables of pulse, speech, physical sensation, and gesture. He goes on to write, these seemingly antiquated, anti-scientific notions do not suggest some vague musical temporal chaos, for historical documents instead expose many rich definitions of rhythm far more practical than absolute formulas or schemas could offer. They relate an aesthetics of time neglected in the modern age, in which subjective, rhythmical qualities transcended the clicks of clockwork, proportional calculations, and even music notation itself. And here I'm going to borrow some of Dr. Bonus's observations on the subject because I think they're fantastic and they get right on the point. Starting with the Enlightenment thinker René Descartes, who in his 1618 treatise Compendium Musicae wrote that singers and instrumentalists observe proportion instinctively, especially in connection with music to which we are accustomed to dance and sway. Here we accompany each beat of the music by a corresponding motion of our body. We are quite naturally impelled to do this by the music. Descartes would demonstrate an understanding in this treatise that musical time consisted either of equal or proportion parts of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. But when it came time to actually applying those proportions to music, one must always respect the body and the ear as the ultimate determiner of their quality. Descartes, the philosopher who famously considers man's intellect to be what sets us apart from the animals, ironically understood our capacity for musical creativity to be fundamentally primal. If you have ever in your life felt compelled to bop your head to a song or sway back and forth to music, you understand this. There is an underlying pulse that is inextricably tied to human movement. As fellow YouTuber Adam Neely pointed out in a recent video,
counting out loud and leveraging the natural rhythm of the human speaking voice is a great way of improving your internal clock.
This, as he mentions, is because English is a stress-timed language, meaning the amount of time between each stressed syllable is relatively even, making the language we use in the West itself a fairly robust measuring stick for even time. Self-referential pulse can be informed by the language we speak, the motion of our bodies, and even something as simple as the beating of the human heart, as Mersenne suggested in Harmonie Universelle. He believed that the tactus, a unit of time generally expressed with the hand in a lot of Renaissance music, should be kept in keeping with the human heart at around 60 to 75 beats per minute. Linguist Andrew Comstock would note in his work A System of Elocution that the same pulsation which enables a band to play together is the same phenomenon which allows a company of soldiers to march synchronously. This is an astute observation given the physical motion of soldiers marching. There's a heavy step, followed by the lift of a foot which repeats. A natural rhythm of the body, which has been referred to by many names over the centuries. The in-breath and the out-breath, emphatic and remiss, the crucis and the metacrucis. Composer Johann Hummel would refer to it in this diagram as the heavy and the light, while theorist Moritz Hauptmann called it the energy of the beginning. My favorite has got to be the ictus metricus, an example of which is brought to us on page 69 of linguist Joshua Steele's 1775 essay, Prosodia Rationalis. The ictus metricus is made up of two parts, the thesis, or the strong beat, and the arsis, the weaker beat. Steele notates the strong beats with solid triangles and the weak beats with dotted triangles. What's fascinating is not the rhythm itself, but what's underneath it. These apostrophes were meant to indicate dynamics, how soft or how hard one is supposed to approach each note. Now, why is it that we seem to have the same information notated twice, but with different symbols? The answer is that while interrelated, these two bands of information indicate two very different things. One, the ictus metricus, the intuitive, unheard but felt rhythmic pulsation that drives the piece. The other, a sounded accent pattern which is overlaid onto the piece, which is necessarily separate but often aligned with the ictus metricus. Theorist Fred Lerdahl and linguist Ray Jackendoff described this phenomenon in their work, A Generative Theory of Tonal Music, as the metrical accent, a mental construct inferred from, but not identical to the patterns of accentuation at the musical surface. We tend to not think of music like this in the real world, right? Like, rhythm is rhythm. I play 4 on the floor, you lock in, heads bob, we have a great time. What's with this implied ghost rhythm that is, for all practical reason, indistinguishable from what I'm actually playing? Well, that ghost rhythm is yours and my intrinsic humanistic relationship to rhythm itself. And we've given away that relationship in modern times to a machine. The pre-metronomic age lasts from, well, I guess the beginning of music to about 1815 when the metronome is invented, although that date is certainly flexible as the metronome wouldn't become ubiquitous in musical culture, in homes and in schools around the world until probably around the early 20th century. Gottfried Weber, our pendulum man, hated the idea of mechanizing musical time. He didn't want to cede what he saw as the soul of music to something that was ultimately soulless. He was pre-metronomic to his core. From that perspective, his practice pendulum only made too much sense. You see, to Weber, the pendulum was always intended as a momentary reference, a visual aid which could lend you the sense of a steady pulse, while simultaneously giving the responsibility of upholding that pace back to you, the performer. The power of time, he felt, must always be given back to the musician it originates from. So here's where we're at. We use metronomes and BPM markings today because Micheal, a great promoter, got one of the most famous musicians in all of history to promote his product. But that's just one reading of history, a small piece of the puzzle and a literal telling of the facts at hand. I think it goes deeper than that. I think that the metronome, or at least what it represents in our culture, has always been inevitable. With or without Beethoven, and certainly without Micheal. To understand the metronome's inevitability, we must first understand Western music's relationship with mathematics. Mostly we deal with microtonal harmony and tuning theory on this channel, so for longtime viewers, this may be a little bit redundant, but I'll try and be brief. I'm gonna have to gloss over some things because a complete history of tuning and all the nuances therein is not the point of this video, and it's not necessary to get my point across. I have somewhere between 50 and 60 books on introductory music theory, and clearly not enough metronomes in my collection, but that's beside the point. Almost all of these books either begin with or at some point reference the importance of math that underpins Western music. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who studied music theory. As our man Descartes would say, it's all about divisions by specific ratios. In rhythm, we divide a whole beat into a half beat, into a quarter beat, into an eighth beat, into a 16th beat, into a 32nd beat, and so on. We think in terms of measures and time signatures defined by specific numerical groupings. But it goes far beyond the rhythmic content of music. How did we get to 12 notes of our equally tempered system, and how did they get tempered in the first place? Most of these books will misattribute the foundations of our tuning system to Pythagoras, who Music Theory for Dummies describes in a rather cavalier fashion was just a dude obsessed with the idea that everything in the world could be broken down into a mathematical formula. The famous observation is that if you split a string, or as theorist Ernst Levy would say, a monochord in half, you'll get a pitch double the frequency of your fundamental tone, a 1-to-2 relationship. If you split it by a third instead, you'll get the fifth interval that has a 3-to-2 relationship back to the fundamental tone. Take that fifth, stack it a bunch of times, and you'll arrive to a 12-note system. This is Pythagorean 3-limit tuning, and it works great until you want to change keys or use harmony where fifths aren't the overwhelming priority. Then you realize, it might not be so great for the musical aesthetics of the modern world where minor and major thirds rule the gambit. We then figure out how to fix Pythagorean tuning by tempering out its quirks, calculating 12-tone equal temperament to the 12th root of 2, meaning that each note is separated by the space of the 12th root of 2 from its nearest neighbor. Now we can, in the words of Leonard Bernstein, go freewheeling through all 12 keys at our chromatic leisure. There is math everywhere in music. And yeah, obviously some of it is just the reality of physics and the acoustical properties of sound, but at some point, the West adopted this scientific reality as the foundation for its preferred aesthetic, and eventually as the ideal for what proper music is and should be. There's even a mathematical model which describes how we perceive sound itself. Composer Norman Kasdan called this the natural law theory, a way to explain why we find some sounds consonant and others dissonant. Basically, in his view, simple harmonic ratios equal consonant sounds. For instance, a perfect fifth, a ratio of 3-to-2, is simple mathematically, so it sounds consonant. A minor second, a ratio of 16-to-15, is much more complex, so we generally perceive it as dissonant. Our ears, you could say, are kind of like measuring tools, and our brain is constantly doing the sonic math, reporting what it finds through the vibes we feel when we listen to harmony. This model is extremely effective at describing specifically how music in the West functions and how an ear that's grown up under its umbrella tends to hear it. This is in part because the West has aligned its musical aesthetic and taste with a mathematical understanding of sound. Classical Greek philosophers like Aristophanes might disagree with this model, stressing that perception of sound is culturally dependent. After all, it seems a little bit reductionist to boil down all of our tastes to a simple equation. An equation which fails, by the way, to describe accurately how music from many non-Western cultures is perceived by native listeners. Again, we're left with two opposing figures, Aristophanes and Kasdan, a pre- and post-metronomist struggling to reconcile their deeply conflicting musical worldviews. Descartes, a student of the scientific revolution, focused on understanding music as a science, as acoustics, while also knowing that there is something deeply natural to music and how we engage with it. The irony is that the revolution in science Descartes championed would eventually produce the means that would sever our natural connection to music. The mechanization of tempo was fueled by the advancements in technology from the Industrial Revolution, the advancements of thought on culture and the natural world from the Enlightenment, and ultimately from the shift and focus on empiricism and rationalism from the Scientific Revolution. This is where our philosophy of music started to shift more dramatically from natural to mechanical. And this is where that philosophy produced the tangible means by which we could take it to its ultimate conclusion. I see the metronome as a symbol of the mathematical, empiricist foundation that underpins Western music. And in this way, the metronome has always been inevitable. This all sounds pretty dramatic, right? I mean, what, the metronome has destroyed our relationship with time and rhythm? What? Could that even be remotely true? I mean, when I attend a classical concert, no one's setting up a metronome to play along to. The musicians look to the conductor to set and govern time. And he's not using a metronome, at least I hope he doesn't have a click track running through his ears. No, he's a human relying on his own humanistic sense of pulse, going through the ebb and flow of it, manipulating time itself through the orchestra as a means of expression and conversation. When I go to a punk show at the local dive bar, the musicians aren't using metronomes either, but you better believe they're locked in, sharing in a communal experience of music and time that is undeniably human. Sure, in their own time, all of these musicians, classical and otherwise, probably use a metronome in the practice room, but when it comes time to actually get on stage and perform, it's all them. That sense of musical time that Weber held so dear is ultimately returned to the hands of those who play, allowing them to connect once again to that ancient humanistic pulse, the ictus metricus, a thread to a philosophy long past. I have absolutely no objection to this argument. I think in a lot of ways, our pre-metronomic relationship with musical time still exists in a large way in live music. From buskers to period music and beyond, you'll find millions of musicians across the globe performing and relating to musical time in this way. But in the realm of recorded popular music, not so much. If you look at any song currently charting in the top 100s, you probably will not be able to find one that was recorded with this humanistic relationship to musical time. Not recording to a click track in the modern era just does not happen anymore. If I hop onto a session and it has not been tracked to a click, I smile on the outside, but on the inside I am screaming in frustration at the lack of professionalism that I have to deal with. With rare exception, popular music is the music of mechanized time. And popular music, like it or not, shapes culture and generations of music that comes after it. The music of our time will be a marker in history showing just how far we've come since the scientific revolution when it comes to our philosophy of music. Almost all of which is recorded inside a DAW, or digital audio workstation. And every DAW, from Logic to Pro Tools to Audacity to Ableton, is built on the same mathematical framework that underpins our very understanding of this kind of music.
The application of science to the arts has opened up new possibilities for integrating them. Computer music is one example of an active partnership between man and machine. Both can influence each other. At Bell Labs, where this computer music is being created, the composer is part of the system and acts as a conductor rather than a player. The sounds of the orchestra are created by electronic parts activated by signals from the computer.
In 1951, Geoff Hill, a computer programmer at the University of Melbourne, became the first person to program a computer, Sirac, to play a musical melody.
Computer music started in earnest in the mid-50s in America in AT&T Bell Labs, but this music, the music that was played with Sirac, actually predates that. This is a fair simulation of what it would have sounded like at the time. It's quite possible that the first music ever played by a computer was by Sirac.
The rhythm of which, you guessed it, was controlled by computer time, a mechanized clock. While innovative at the time, this was a fairly primitive demonstration. Sirac wasn't ever meant to be used as a musical tool. The only reason it had a loudspeaker connected to it in the first place was so that you could write an instruction for any given program for the computer to send regular pulses to the speaker. This was done so you could track with your ears where the program was at any given moment and alert you if things went a little haywire. With a bit of clever planning, one could punch out pulse sequences into these paper tapes that included simple instructions regarding pitch, duration, and intensity. These tapes would then be fed into the computer, telling it what to do and when to do it. The paper tapes Hill would use were 3-inch wide paper rolls containing 12 equally spaced rows, a grid for precise mathematically spaced time. The musical time that the program handled was built in ones and zeros, specified as duration with digit codes on Geoff Hill's own programming instructions. In 1957, Max Matthews, an engineer at Bell Labs, writes Music, the first computer program for generating digital audio waveforms through direct synthesis. And while this part of the story usually gets the limelight for being the world's first Vocaloid, Max Matthews programmed everything with a bias towards perfect mechanized time, the consequences of which would ripple throughout the age of electronic music. His music program would be the progenitor to many programming languages that run our music tech world today, such as Max MSP, Pure Data, JSON, and Super Collider. In the late 1970s, legendary instrument designer Roger Lynn scribbles out a program, a visual grid matrix where each horizontal square represented a measured block of time, and each vertical square designated different drum sounds. Using asterisks, one could map out drum patterns on this grid to be triggered with samples. The purpose? He wants to redesign the drum machine, giving the programmer more choice when it comes to rhythmic feel. He expands this grid from a 16-note division to 192 per measure division in software, and designs a hardware grid interface producers could actually play with buttons and pads. This expansion was intended so that musicians could replicate the real-time human feel of actual drummers on a machine. But since the style of producers at the time was so loop-based, any mistakes in the initial performance would get looped infinitum. So Lynn devised what he called a timing correct function, which would move wayward notes to their closest point on a 16-note grid, ironically correcting human time by snapping imperfect input to metronomic perfection. Lynn's time correct function would later be called quantization. Finally, the fate of computer time would be sealed with the implementation of MIDI, the universal protocol which allows computers, drum machines, and synths to communicate with each other. If music is architecture, the grid is the bedrock that all modern music software is built on. And quantization is the blueprints from which we build our houses and determine their quality. Not used to playing to a click, but you want to make the music flow? Well, if you get most of the way there, we can now simply nudge a late kick drum into place or shift an early snare to line up with the geometry of an increasingly universally correct musical aesthetic. Just the concept of quantization would become so ubiquitous, we'd start to see its DNA override our ideal for perfect pitch as well. With software like Auto-Tune or pitch correct plugins like Melodyne, we can ensure the same level of mathematical precision for pitch and harmony that we can for musical time. The recorded world of music has a certain permanence that live music can never have. Its fidelity of captured information is and will always be significantly more fine-grained than that of music notation. You can obviously record those live performances for sure, but when you turn on Spotify or catch a tune when you're walking around at a party, you're hearing the studio recorded version almost guaranteed. When we record with respect paid to the grid, to the metronome that is in itself a symbol for our ideological framework, we inevitably will produce works that promote that ideology. If you use the grid, you're showing your support of it. I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying that's what it is. However, if the top charting songs are all pitch corrected, quantized, and grid based, you run the risk of signaling to a world of upcoming artists that allegiance to the grid is necessary if you want to be taken seriously as a professional. What you're doing is saying that there's a correct and incorrect way of going about this specific type of music without actually saying it. Today, we are so deeply entrenched into the supremacy of the grid, haunted by the ghost of the mechanical metronome, which was set upon the world by a thought that a simplified mathematical framework should govern society's artistic preference and taste for all time. This is the gridification of music. I want to wrap this up with a story I came across while researching through the local newspaper archives here in Thomaston. It's about the untimely end of this iconic metronome factory. Seth Thomas made metronomes, but also was at one point one of the most well-known and respected clock companies in America. They made mantle clocks and grandfather clocks and clock towers that to this day can be found in almost every state across the nation. Even this iconic clock at Grand Central Station in New York is a Seth Thomas. From the moment when Seth Thomas himself opened his factory doors in 1813, through when the company merged with West Clocks in 1930, to when control of the company was lost in a corporate takeover in the 1970s, all of these clocks and metronomes were made here, providing jobs for thousands of people in this small, proud community. Little by little, year by year, industry would start to dry up all across America. Good jobs would be exported overseas to be completed more efficiently at half the price. The Seth Thomas Company would be no exception, facing a market that preferred plastic perfection over wooden craftsmanship at a bargain rate. The company would start to sink, and after a hostile corporate takeover at the hands of Tally Industries, an airbag manufacturer in the 1970s, there would no longer be any jobs for factory clockmakers on this side of the Connecticut River. When the factory closed for good in 1982, the 4 remaining employees of this once great bastion of American innovation paced through its empty halls one last time. The papers tell us it was raining that day. In one final act of defiance towards this unjust corporate takeover, a funeral was held. Not for any man, woman, or child, but for a curious little timepiece, the Royal Seth. The 4 men, all dressed in black, wearing white gloves, carried the timepiece on a bier behind a hearse to its final resting spot in a green, not far away from the old factory. The whole town showed up in solidarity. There was a priest. There were final words said. There was anger, there was community, and there was loss. The Royal Seth was set ablaze. Its ashes were sent to the executives of Tally Industries. The 4 men were let go a week later. Tally Industries had exported all factory jobs to Savannah, Georgia, where they could pay their employees the state minimum wage of $1.25 per hour, almost $3 per hour less than what they were spending on employees in Connecticut. Eventually, production would be outsourced from the United States completely, as Tally Industries realized that they could cut labor costs even more by doing so. The Seth Thomas line of clocks and metronomes would from that point be manufactured overseas, where wooden cases would be exchanged for plastic enclosures and handmade manual movements replaced with cheap battery-powered quartz machinery. The Seth Thomas name would be the only thing that remained on new products from the good old days, a ghost of its former self. The same story is told again and again in the United States throughout the 20th and 21st century. From the steel industry to the textile industry and beyond, it would all begin to dry up and be exported elsewhere. Connecticut was once renowned for its clock-making artisanship. Eli Terry and Seth Thomas were basically horological American royalty, essentially reshaping the economic landscape for this part of the country for a long time. But nothing lasts forever. When we prioritize efficiency, profit, mechanization, technological progress, and a mathematical understanding of the natural world, there are consequences, good and bad. Musicianship prospered from metronomic ideology. I could not be the musician I am today without it, and I'm sure a lot of the music I love and cherish would not be the same without it. But is there a point where our metronomic ideology takes us too far? Is there a point where our musical soul itself is exported out from within us and given to a machine to keep the sounds running? 19th century America prospered from the Industrial Revolution. We had economic boom, we had jobs, and above all, we had hope. But the same ideology which drove us towards that prosperity would eventually lead to the Seth Thomas factory shutting down, decimating hundreds of thousands of lives of good, hardworking people. It's exceedingly hard to grapple with because it seems like today, every facet of our lives is in whole or in part built off of this ideology. So in some ways, it seems hypocritical to push back. But I think it's necessary. The naturalist understanding of music was supplanted by thinkers like Descartes, who understood music as math in theory, but deeply human in practice. This humanity was discarded as these thinkers became more and more consumed by their own ideology, giving rise to the mechanical metronome of the industrial age. And then, in a twist, the mechanical metronome itself fell into obscurity, being left in the dust of our collective piano benches, being replaced with DAWs and apps from a society on a never-ending march towards technological progress and efficiency. I feel like I need to put in this tiny little disclaimer. I don't think that a mathematical empiricist understanding of the world is necessarily a bad thing. Quite the opposite, actually. Trust me, I am thrilled when I get in my car in the morning and I put the key in and I turn and the vehicle works. That's great. And that Google Maps can, take me where I need to go, and that the medicine I'm prescribed has gone through clinical trials so that I can be reasonably sure that it works reliably, and that we figured out Newtonian physics and the internet and a whole bunch of other things that are great that only work because we do science. I have absolutely no problem with trying to understand the natural world through a mathematical framework or a scientific lens. What I'm weary about is those who take something like the physics of sound and say, this is what determines what sounds good. Absolutely. I'm pushing back against the idea that beauty and neat-looking math are necessarily one and the same. Beauty is subjective. I'm with Aristoxenus on this one. And don't get me wrong, there definitely is overlap here, and quite a bit of it. Why we enjoy things is a very messy, very nuanced subject steeped in years of history and culture, and is not the point of this video. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I must ask, did the metronome ruin music? Well, yes and no. I've spent a considerable amount of time on this channel demonstrating that how we create, the tools that we use, or the mediums that we engage with have a deep and profound influence on the music we're able to make. Did the metronome ruin music? Well, on its face, it kind of sounds like a ridiculous question, right? I mean, as a practice tool, the metronome has aided millions and millions of people to perfect their craft and develop a solid sense of time. Music in the last 50 years would sound very, very different if the metronome had never existed. And even if you take the question in the abstract, the metronome as a concept to refer to the mechanization of time or the propagation of natural law as music supreme, it still seems like a ridiculous question, because in that sense, the metronome has always existed in Western music as a symbol for our march towards perfection. You can't separate the two, especially when your brand of music theory begins and ends with a Pythagorean observation. It's like asking if the circle ruined the wheel. Did the metronome ruin music? Well, it certainly changed our relationship with it. When it comes to the gridification of music, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I kind of think it's both. Probably, maybe. I tend to think of things like the grid like they're tools, and with any tool you can use it for beauty or mediocrity, but the tool is, generally neutral. Now, reasonable minds will, of course, disagree with that, but what I find to be true about humans and opinions is that anything new is always going to be met with a certain level of skepticism and pushback. The old guard is always going to roll their eyes at how the young conduct themselves.
The new stuff that these kids are listening to nowadays, it's just not real music. Back in the day, we actually had to play our instruments. Quantization, auto-tune, pitch correct? No, that's just cheating. There's no talent anymore. It's all about getting clicks.
The irony is that this sentiment is usually held by a generation that when they were younger, their parents thought the exact same thing about their music. And, more ironic still is that when we get older, we're probably going to think the exact same thing about our children. It's a cycle of culture that comes and goes. Consider Plautus, the Roman playwright in the 2nd century BC, who railed against the invention of one of our oldest time-telling tools, which was new at the time, the sundial. The gods confound the man who first found out how to distinguish the hours. Confound him too, who in this place set up a sundial to cut and hack my days so wretchedly into small portions. When I was a boy, my belly was my sundial, one more sure, truer, and more exact than any of them. This dial told me when 'twas proper time to go to dinner and when I ought to eat. Trust me, we've been complaining about time innovations for, and excuse the pun, a long time. Perhaps it's no surprise that one of the largest YouTube channels around concerning itself with music and the communication of music theory makes most of its views exploiting this very concern. And while I don't accept the gridification of music as being entirely negative, I do understand the frustration of how deeply integrated the grid tool is to the platform we most often record on. In our DAWs, the grid is inescapable, fully assimilated at many levels of functionality. You can say a hammer is just a tool all you like, but if it's the only tool you're ever given, you're probably going to use it, and it's probably going to determine a lot of what you're able to make. That said, I think weighing in on whether the current state of music is good or bad is, I don't know, it's just kind of boring. I'm not the guy for that. Ultimately, to me, it's much more interesting to look at grid-based music as a marker for the time that we are currently living in. Agrarian societies thought of time in terms of changing seasons and the setting sun. Medieval monastic societies' relationship with time was rooted in officium, canonical hours set by a creator and followed by the clergy. Modern societies function around the precise mathematical measurement of the second, the minute, and the hour. These wildly different understandings of time are all valid. They all live in their own unique context of history and go a long way in telling us something about the lives, art, and music of the people who lived with them. Where does the gridification of song stand in the history of the world's music? What does the music we make today collectively say about the times we live in? I'm afraid only time will tell. Huge thank you to all of my patrons now on screen. These videos would just not be possible without your support. As you can probably imagine, there is a significant amount of archival research, travel, and production costs that go into these kinds of videos. I don't have a team, I'm just one guy, and well, sometimes one dog, so your support really does go a long way in allowing me to do this full time. Special thank you to the Blender artist Micheal Klee, who allowed me to feature some of his work from his History of Musical Time collection. Check him out in the description below. Thank you, of course, to the amazing Ali Boyer for creating the animation sequence for the Metronome funeral. And a huge shout out to the University of Amsterdam for their archival resources, as well as the Thomaston Opera House for allowing me to use their facility to film. The Opera House is currently seeking donations to restore the Romanesque ceiling of their historic concert hall. A donation link for that will be down in the description below, as well as all of my sources that appeared throughout this video. If you'd like to support the channel, Patreon is by far the best way for you to do that if you can afford it. When you sign up for the microtonalist tier, you get access to a bunch of my lectures on 31-tone equal temperament, my microtonality for the Modern Musician series, as well as access to a bunch of music theory resources and behind-the-scenes material. We await you with open arms and, of course, a whole lot of notes.